Hello, and welcome to Coping with Loss in a Pandemic, the COVID-19 series. My name is Tom Anthony, and I'll be your moderator for the next few videos. Our purpose in this series is to provide information to those who lose loved ones during pandemics. We specifically reference COVID-19 because that is what is occurring right now. This series is designed for those of us who have lost a loved one during the pandemic, whether that be a COVID death itself, an unrelated death, or a death by an economic or social consequence of the pandemic, such as a suicide or unintentional overdose. This series is also for people who want to understand and help assist anyone who has experienced these losses. The series is comprised of 3 videos. Part 1, Loss and Trauma, discussing the losses and traumas that have presented themselves to us during this pandemic, which create challenges for all of us, but particularly for those of us who lose loved ones during this time. Part 2, 12 Coping Strategies, looks at specific steps you can take right now to cope with the loss of your loved one during the pandemic. And Part 3, Loss Over Time, looks at how to move forward with your loss after the pandemic and into the future. We are lucky to be joined by 2 world-renowned experts for this series. Dr. Therese Rando, the founder and clinical director for the Institute for the Study and Treatment of Loss in Warwick, Rhode Island. A practicing clinical psychologist, she is identified as one of the world's foremost experts on sudden and traumatic loss. And Dr. Kenneth J. Doka, the senior consultant to the Hospice Foundation of America. A prolific author in the field of dying, death, and bereavement, he is acknowledged as one of its preeminent leaders. Now, without further ado, welcome to Coping with Loss in a Pandemic, the COVID-19 series. Hello, and thank you for joining us for the next installment of Coping with Loss During a Pandemic, the COVID-19 series. I am once again joined by Doctors Kenneth J. Doka and Dr. Therese Rando. Thank you for joining me. In our first video, we talked about loss and trauma in a pandemic, specifically what makes COVID-19 different and some of the challenges associated with the type of loss and trauma. In the second video, we went over 12 self-help strategies to cope with trauma and loss during this time. Now, in our final video, we will be talking about what else can be done for you to move forward from this terrible loss. So both of you, so if and when once things return to normal, what experiences should this grieving person consider?
Okay, I think that as hopefully our lives do come back to whatever the new normal is, or whenever we reach that point, that people might say, are there things that I still need to do from the past pandemic? Maybe, for example, they didn't have the funeral ritual that they wanted, and this is an opportunity, as we said, to have a possible memorial service or an anniversary mass or whatever is part of your tradition. And the like, to say maybe we need to really look at this person's life again in a different way. I think it's always important to look back and suggest, how have I changed in this experience? How has my philosophy, my faith been challenged and changed? In what ways am I still struggling with issues of loss and grief, and how do I want to handle those? And then finally, another question is, how have I grown during this period? One of the things we always want to realize is that even as we are mourning and grieving, going through those processes, there still is the potential for human growth. We may have a stronger, more resilient philosophy now, a stronger faith now. We may have learned new skills. We may have developed new kinds of relationships or new kinds of sensitivities. So again, I think it's important to look back and to take stock.
One of the things that I would do is to look at this in terms of what do I need to do in terms of my loved one, and what do I need to do in terms of myself.
A nice way of looking at that.
There are people who might say, well, we did have a very limited funeral So we've had the funeral. No. You had a very limited funeral, and that if that was not what you would have otherwise had, that did not meet your needs, if that was not adapted for you, but was only what you needed to have because of the circumstances, you can look at another ritual. You can have another ritual, even though the body is not there, even though there has already been something as minimal as it was. You can do something that will meet your needs. And you have to say to yourself, what do I need to do in this regard? You may want to invite a close circle of friends, or you may want to have a big gathering to commemorate the life and the passing of your loved one. And I would urge you to really look at what you would ideally want to do and to see whether or not that's feasible. One of the things that we know is that the importance of having other people there cannot be overstated. And there may have been people, for instance, who are not able to get there, and you want them to be part of another kind of ritual. So the bottom line is you can have more than one ritual if the one that you had was not able to meet your needs. And you definitely can have it without a body present. I work all of the time with individuals where there may be no body that has been found, or there is an inability to view it, or some other circumstance that makes it different than a traditional viewing or funeral, or perhaps there were things that you would have wanted to do in your particular faith tradition or your cultural tradition in terms of washing the body, or carrying the casket, or wrapping the body, or what have you. And this is where I say people need to get creative and to do things that in constructive and therapeutic, healthy ways can meet their needs to accomplish what they would have ideally wanted to do at the time that now they have to do symbolically. And so I would encourage people to look at that and to look upon this as an opportunity to creatively meet the needs that unfortunately didn't get to be met at the time of the death, given the pandemic. The second thing is to look at what you need now. You may have had to postpone some of your mourning because you couldn't attend to it then. When we have ongoing crises in our life, at the same time that we lose a loved one, we're not able to attend sufficiently to that loved one's loss because we have to be dealing with whatever else is going on. And in the pandemic, there were so many things going on, plus our own life threat and threat to other loved ones, that we just didn't have the luxury, if you will, to be able to have the time to attend to it. Or there might have been too much going on. We just couldn't. We were frozen, or we were numb. And we know that numbness, especially in the beginning, is part of any kind of traumatic reaction. So it may only be over time that it becomes apparent some things you need to do. It's in few cases is it ever the truth where it's like totally too late to do anything. So even if this is down the road a little bit, and you were not able to pay attention to it, doesn't mean you cannot pay attention to your loss now. Perhaps you had set that intention. When things get better, I'm going to really take the time I need to pay attention to my loved one. And I've worked, the longest case for me, and I'm sure people have had other cases, was a man came in 60 years after the death of his mother from suicide. And he had never been able to pay attention to it, to grieve it, because of messages from the family to basically, get over it. And 60 years later, 6 decades later, we were able to pay attention to that grief in a way that freed him of 6 decades worth of burden under the unaddressed grief. So it's never too late to pay attention to that. And if over time you realize, you know what, maybe I do need some help with this, you can get some assistance with this. It's never too late.
And I think there may be even some personal things you may want to do. Sometimes immediately after the loss, you're not ready to do things like go through photos and things of that nature. But one of my clients once decided that he'd go through all the pictures and really do almost a pictorial history of their marriage. So he put in order pictures from the honeymoon right to their 50th anniversary, and then during some of the time that they dealt with the illness. And it was a wonderful way for him to come to terms with the life they had together. So, do what you feel you need to do.
And I also think that the concept of readiness is very important for us to appreciate. That there are things that we can't do until we've done other things. Unfortunately, as much as people around us may want us to hurry up and be on a timetable and go from one to another, sometimes we can't. Sometimes there are certain issues we can't deal with until we have demonstrated to ourselves that we can survive and we can take care of our families and we can get back to work. And only then may we be able to go and deal with something that might make us feel a little more vulnerable. It's not necessarily the case where we deal with all the vulnerable things first and then can go on to other things. So what I'm basically saying is that we need to understand that there's not a strict timetable, and that sometimes we have to accomplish certain things in our life before we are able to give ourselves permission to do other more intimate or possibly painful things. The only caveat is some people will keep trying to kick the can down the road and never deal with those things. That will not necessarily stand them in good stead, because that kind of unfinished business of grief that needs to be attended to, that's not attended to, can haunt people and can make them not only psychologically disturbed, but also can cause physical problems, the social problems, and so forth. So as long as we're not doing this to just keep kicking the can down the road, it's okay to understand that, we may have to do certain things first before we can attend to other things in our mourning. But at some point in time, that mourning needs to be attended to.
Mm. Yeah, so you mentioned this timetable or this unaddressed grief. So what is it? What should people expect? When should the grief end?
Well, as my dear friend Bill Warden would say, that's like saying how high is up. It's all going to be very relative. And in fact, this is where I find it useful to make a distinction between grief and mourning. Grief being the reactions to the perception of loss, and then mourning being how we continue those reactions and then move into making attempts to cope with them, to make shifts so we can accommodate the loss. Because that's the key to me, is that you don't get over loss, you make room for it in your life. You didn't want it, you do anything to not have it, but it's a fact. So what do I have to do to accommodate this having happened in my life? And that may make some of the mandate some of the shifts that we talked about in earlier videos, in terms of needing to change your worldview, change your sense of yourself, change some of your expectations, and so forth. In terms of the grief, your grief, in terms of crying every day, for instance, may be over within, a number of months or a year or two. But in terms of mourning, making the necessary accommodations so to fit in our lives, that really, in essence, can go on for the rest of our lives. Doesn't mean you stay in acute grief for the rest of your life. That would be unhealthy. But for instance, when your daughter is getting married and, your wife is not here to see her be a bride, you may have what we call a subsequent temporary upsurge of grief, or a stug reaction at that point in time, where for her loss, when this is 10 years after she died and you're seeing your daughter be a bride and her mom's not here to see her. Or when your child, gets to be the age of his deceased sister. That can be very upsetting. Or when you see someone who looks like your father, or when you hear the song that you and your wife used to dance to. These are all things. There are events or stimuli that remind us of the loss and underscore it for us. And
Yeah.
you're going to have these. And this does not mean that you have not dealt with your loss. If you're having them every day and they're totally derailing you, that suggests you have more to process. But you can have done all the best work in the world on your loss. And there can be things that happen down the pike that will bring up this subsequent temporary, key is temporary, upsurge of grief for someone we've loved and lost that just reminds us of that person. And like on their birthday or perhaps on the anniversary of their death. And that is something that I think we can expect to see. It does not suggest any pathology if it happens in those moderate ways that I'm talking about.
Yeah, I would agree. And I would say that one of the ways our theories of grief has changed from Freud's article, which was one of the first articles about grief about slightly over 100 years ago, is that we no longer look at ourselves as detaching from the person who died. We recognize that we always have a continuing connection with them. That connection is in our memories. That connection is in the legacies. I start every day by making a list of things to do, which is something my dad did, and I learned from him. And whenever I do it, it has a sense of closeness to him. My son does it as well now. So we have the legacies, sometimes the liabilities. We have the ways we experience connection in our faith or in our life experiences. Maybe we dream of the person. We're always going to have that connection. I like to use the term amelioration of grief. And what I mean by that term is that over time, for most people, the pain lessens and lessens considerably. But you learn to function again. And you're able to function as you were before, and sometimes even better, because you've learned, as we said, you've grown through your grief process. But that doesn't mean we're not going to have those upsurges of grief. And all of that is very, very normal. So I guess the short answer to your question, Tom, is that in my mind, grief doesn't end or mourning doesn't end. Mm-hmm. We live with that loss throughout our lives, but that doesn't mean we have to be in pain. It means we will always keep those memories and we will always keep those connections. Mm-hmm. And many times that's very reassuring and comforting to people.
And I think one other thing I would add is that because the loss of your loved one occurred during the COVID-19 pandemic, you may find yourself being looked at by other people as, one of those COVID mourners. We saw this after 9/11, when people who lost loved ones in the attacks in 9/11 were kind of all put together in the same group. And people that I worked with in that population resented that because, their losses were all different, even though it happened under the same set of circumstances. Yeah. And so I think you need to resist the negative aspects of being assigned the identity of a COVID-19 pandemic mourner. Mm-hmm. If it gives you some support, if it legitimizes your loss, if it allows you to have connections with people where you can share certain things with them because of the commonalities you share, recognizing there'll be differences, that's fine. But don't let yourself be pigeonholed. And if there are articles written about, COVID-19 mourners, they may or may not apply to you. And so just recognize that you are more like yourself before the loss than you necessarily are like somebody else who has had the same loss. Yeah. May share some commonalities, but, you are still, a lot of you is still you, although we would hope that there would be growth. And of course, there's going to be some changes as well.
And there may be some sensitivities as well. You use the analogy of a broken bone, and I always joke when I broke my arm that I could always tell you when it was going to rain. Yeah. Because there'd be a little bit of pain and a little bit of sensitivity, and so because you've lived through a traumatic event, you may be more sensitive. You may be the first person who notices a new disease starting in another place of the world, and create some anxiety, and that's very normal and natural too. When we experience a traumatic loss, it makes us more sensitive to the fact that sometimes the world isn't always as predictable and safe, as benevolent as we like to hope it is.
Right.
Hmm. So then what does the future hold for COVID mourners? What can we expect?
Well, I think we've kind of covered that in many ways. I think that anybody mourning in this period certainly faces some complications that we've identified, whether they've died of COVID or not of COVID. And certainly we want to recognize those who've had non-death losses. And we also want to recognize health and health professionals who are dealing with this, who may have their own issues. That's probably a whole separate video, probably not one that we're going to do. But in any case, I think we need to recognize that, yeah, this is a different period. The very nature of the COVID crisis has complicated mourning for everybody who's experienced loss. But we've gone through even worse plagues in the past. We've gone through the influenza epidemic. We've gone through the bubonic plague, the Black Death, and I think one of the things we've learned as we've looked at disease is we are a resilient race of humans, and this may change our society. It may change the way we do things, but we'll get through it.
And I think I would like to add to that people can expect to change over time. Where you are with your loss at 2 months is going to be different than at 2 years. It's going to be different than at 20 years. And the notion that you're either, you're in grief or out of grief, in the sense of that it's never going to happen again. I think we've indicated in terms of the mourning, there always may be something that can kick it up, and it does evolve. It's kind of like, what I often see when people are trying to decide, well, what do I do with the possessions of my loved ones? And they don't want to get rid of them, but where do I put them? They might keep them in the closet for a while, and then a while later they may move them to the upstairs attic, and a while later they may put them in the garage, and it may only be years down the line that they can give them to Goodwill or actually throw them out. So we may have to do things in little stages. And one of the things that I'm very mindful of is that human beings evolve, and that your where you are now is not going to be where you're going to end up. And there's going to be a lot of fluctuation, and recognize that. And because this all happened during a trauma, there will be these sensitivities that Ken's talking about. If there are other pandemics, you might feel yourself getting a little anxious, and recognize that. And there'll probably be some acknowledgement of that in the general society as a whole. But where you are with your loss can be, even once it's stable, which will take a while to get to that point, by the way. This notion of, expecting you to be kind of plateau where you're going to end up being within the first couple of years. No, not after a sudden traumatic loss. No way. There's absolutely no way. There's some research that suggests that it takes a couple of years to even get it 24/7. But what I'm saying is, so there'll be a lot of evolutions, and understand that. It's like Ken talked in a previous video about a roller coaster. And even when things get farther out, there may be things that happen that can bring issues to you, and can present you with challenges. And then other times when things are fine. So don't expect it to be static, is the bottom line. Expect that there's movement, just like everything else in life. There's shifts, there's ups and downs, there's turns. Same thing is going to be true with you dealing with your loved one's loss.
Great. So there is hope. There is hope for all of us. And throughout this video series, we've touched on how COVID makes trauma and loss more challenging, how it makes grief more complicated. In the last video, we discussed self-help strategies that you yourself can use, and you can use to help those around you. And we just discussed in this video, what we can do to move forward. And so before we wrap up here, is there anything else, any final words of wisdom that you can give to any COVID mourner out there who's just looking for that piece of advice?
I would say that traumatically bereaved people can and do survive, and that it is okay to be okay, to get to a point where you're okay, you're not betraying your loved one, and that you can move forward with that person in a healthy fashion in your life.
And I would say, acknowledge your strengths, use them, understand your weaknesses, try to limit them, get help if you need it, from wherever you find it, and again, you'll keep that connection. That's the end of grief. Excuse me. While the pain will ease, the connection will always be there, and that can comfort us as we struggle with loss. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Doka, Dr. Rando. Thank you so much for joining us today. And thank you, viewers, for joining us on this last installment of Coping with Loss During a Pandemic, the COVID-19 series. Thank you.